in the course of the program, I mentioned that there's kind of a cottage industry, or at least I alluded to it. There's a cottage industry among law professors coming up with ingenious theories to justify the current welfare state and regulatory state by ascribing new meanings to various constitutional terms. Interestingly enough, the founders predicted that this might happen. There was a discussion among both Federalists who favored the Constitution and Anti-Federalists who opposed the Constitution about the risks of what they call sophistry. Now, those of you who may remember your Greek history may remember something about sophistry. The Sophists were philosophers, phony philosophers, who were traveling salesmen. They were sort of like stand-up comedians without all of the funniness. They would go from city to city putting on shows with verbal fireworks. They could prove to you that the sky was black during the midday. And once they were finished proving it was black, they would then turn around and prove that it wasn't black. They could use words to demonstrate pretty much anything they wanted to demonstrate. And so there was a significant fear expressed among the founders that however clear we are in the Constitution, that advocates of government power will always come up with sophistical ways, with ways of sophistry, to change the language to justify whatever they want to do. That's one of the reasons the Bill of Rights was adopted, to hammer home that we really mean that this is a government of limited powers. And that did work, again, for about 150 years. Then there are those who understand the Constitution quite differently that really can't exactly be called sophists.
Jackpot, brother. Well, ask me, what's the question again? Where in the Constitution does it give you the authority to... No, that's what I thought.
Okay. Thank you, Justin. Justin Longo, who put it together. Well, for the next few minutes, we're going to talk about if you do want to limit the federal government to constitutional limits, how do we do that? I don't, of course, have a complete answer to that, or I would have put it into effect long ago. However, there was one gentleman who considered this issue at great length during his very long life. It was James Madison. And James Madison, in the course of his various writings, left various clues as to how the people and the states should proceed if they thought that the federal government was exceeding its rightful authority. Now, there's a handout that you should have been given when you were registered, and that might be useful right now. I'm going to go through this handout and give you various comments on it. Without trying to be particularly prescriptive, it will suggest some ideas. But let me just mention one point. When I first got involved in this issue of state legislative responses to federal overreaching, I served as an advisor to a chairwoman of a committee in Montana that was dealing with the issue of federal overreaching. The newspapers described us as a bunch of right-wing extremists. And surprise. And of course, I pointed out to them that the struggle between states and federal government, there's nothing extreme about it. It was deliberately written by the founders into the Constitution. Again, it's part of the system of checks and balances, similar to the checks and balances between different branches of the federal government. So when you've got pushback from the states or even from individuals against federal authority, that's not unusual. That's how the system was supposed to work. Now the cause could be a good one, it could be a bad one, but the process of pushback from the states and from the people was built into the system. So let's look first at a letter that I'll be quoting several times here that James Madison wrote. This is in 1830, and he wrote this letter at the height of the Nullification Crisis. James Madison, I should tell you, opposed nullification. His Virginia Resolution of 1798, which is sometimes cited as being pro-nullification, actually was not, as he tried to explain later. And I'll get into the implications of that later. But in 1830, he's writing a letter explaining how the states and the people should respond in the case the federal government exceeds its power if they can't use nullification. He writes, when the alien and sedition laws were passed in contravention to the opinions and feelings of the community, the first elections that ensued put an end to them. Dave Kopel made an allusion to this in his remarks. One way in which to respond to unconstitutional overreaching is to punish the rogues at the polls. And that's what Madison is saying here. It's not a perfect response, it's not a sufficient response, but it is one part of a response strategy. In number 46 of the Federalist, Madison is dealing with the question raised by the opponents of the Constitution: what happens if the federal government gets too big and too aggressive? And in Federalist 46, he lists several different ways to respond. He writes, the disquietude of the people, their repugnance, and perhaps refusal to cooperate with the officers of the Union. Now, here's another instance in which the language has changed. By the way, those of you who are really interested in the Constitution quickly become aware of this. And that is that you can never count on the words of the 18th century quite meaning what they mean today. For the most part, the language is the same, but there are important differences. The word repugnance here means they're fighting back. Today we say repugnance of, that stinks, you know. But in those days, the word repugnance generally meant to fight back. The disquietude to the people, they're fighting back. They're responding in various hostile ways, and their refusal to cooperate with the officers of the Union. So here you have James Madison saying there is a role for civil disobedience. Martin Luther King would agree. However, Madison believed, and I think he was right about this, that in order for federalism really to work, when the federal government grows too big, response by individuals alone is not going to be enough. That really you need response from state governments in defense of their own privileges and prerogatives under the Constitution as a way of limiting federal overreach. The word that Madison used to describe all the ways in which a state might respond was the word interposition. Literally putting yourself in between. The states are putting themselves in between the federal government and the people. So state interposition. He continues in Federalist 46. Should an unwarrantable measure of the federal government be unpopular in particular states, which would seldom fail to be the case, or even a warrantable measure be so, which may sometimes be the case, the means of opposition to it are powerful and at hand. And he goes on in Federalist 46 to describe those. I strongly recommend that number of the Federalist to you. Another source of his writings in which he deals with this issue is the famous Virginia Resolution of 1798. He writes, in case of a deliberate, palpable, and dangerous exercise of other powers not granted by the state said compact, meaning the Constitution, the states who are parties thereto have the right and are in duty bound to interpose, there's that word interposition, to interpose, for arresting the progress of evil and for maintaining within their respective limits the authorities, rights, and liberties appertaining to them. The states have, in other words, the right and the obligation to defend the federal system by interposition. Well, what other types of interposition are there? Let's go back to Federalist number 46. The embarrassments. Now here's another word change, folks. Embarrassment. The word embarrassment in the 18th century means an obstacle. It doesn't mean, oh shucks, my face is red, I'm embarrassed. But the word, look at the little word bar in the word embarrassment. A bar, an obstacle. Like I'm financially embarrassed. I've got a financial obstacle. The embarrassments created by legislative devices, which would often be added on such occasions, would oppose in any state difficulties not to be despised, would form in a large state very serious impediments. In other words, Madison is saying the states ought to go ahead and, yes. Sorry? Sorry. Right. Well, then let's come back to embarrassments. I've never done anything like that before. You've got to believe me. All right, so let's look at his methods of interposition. Number one, public relations. He writes in Federalist 46 of the frowns of the executive magistrate of the state. This simply means the governor or the other executive officials saying that they disagree with what the federal government is doing. You saw a lot of this during the early 1990s over the issues of unfunded federal mandates, where governors such as Michigan Governor John Engler publicly complained about federal mandates and tried to rally public support. Then Democratic Governor Ben Nelson of Nebraska did the same thing. Just return. Another excerpt, it's not listed, the source isn't listed here, but from the Virginia resolution, that the General Assembly doth particularly protest against the palpable and alarming infractions of the Constitution in the two late cases of the Alien Sedition Acts passed at the last session of Congress. Just as the executive magistracy can make public relations statements against federal action, so can the legislature. In 1994, a rage passed through the country for 10th Amendment resolutions. You may remember those. This particular rage, if it can be called that, started here in Colorado. The Colorado legislature announced that federal actions were in excess of its authority in violation of the 14th Amendment, and it was taking back its powers. Of course, those were only statements of opinion. They did not have legal effect, but they did have the effect of raising awareness of the 10th Amendment. Today, more people, I think, are aware of the 10th Amendment by far than they would have been, say, 20, 30 years ago. Method of interposition number two, lobbying Congress. I won't read this all, other than to say that Madison believed that it was altogether appropriate for state officials to go to Congress and tell Congress directly that they thought Congress was out of line. Now, of course, they could do this more easily when senators were elected by the state legislatures, but they can still do it again today. I started to mention John Engler of Michigan. John Engler, during the unfunded mandates episode, literally, almost literally, camped out in the lobby of the House of Representatives for a period of about 2 weeks to get anti-mandates legislation passed, which in fact he got. Okay. Method of interposition number three, judicial challenges. You can see we're moving up the scale. Again, I'm not going to read this lengthy excerpt from Madison's 1830 letter. But his basic point here is that the states retain power to sue. Now, they may not always have standing. Dave mentioned one famous U.S. Supreme Court case that denied a state the standing to challenge a federal program. And that case was recently cited in one of the United States Courts of Appeals when they threw out a lawsuit against Obamacare brought by Virginia. So there are limits as to what the state can sue on and the circumstances in which the state can sue, but they still have a lot better chance of getting a hearing in court than individuals do. So if you don't like Obamacare, then you must conclude, I think, that John Suthers is probably doing the right thing by challenging it. And let me also make a PR, I'm going to take off my constitutional hat for a minute, put on my political hat. You might want to let him know. Because these guys hear from the other side all the time with paid letter writing campaigns. They don't hear much from our side. And they need to hear it. And they also hear when they do things wrong. They need to hear it when they do things right. They need a slap on the back, a slap on the back. Okay? Politicians are human, and they need positive reinforcement, as the psychologists say. Now we're at page 3. The embarrassments created by legislative devices, which would often be added on such occasions, would oppose in any state difficulties not to be despised, would form in a very large state very serious impediments. A few years ago, the Montana legislature passed a law called the Montana Firearms Freedom Act. Since we got applause on that, I'll tell you I had a little bit to do with the drafting of that. Don't take that too far. It wasn't a lot to do. I wasn't central, but a good friend of mine was involved, and we talked a lot about it. And the Montana Firearms Freedom Act is a law that is deliberately designed to set up a challenge to some of the lousy precedents that Dave alluded to in the Supreme Court. Specifically, it states that firearms which are made within Montana from Montana materials and kept within Montana are subject to regulation of Montana law and Fed stay out. And several other states have now adopted similar laws. Again, this is not beyond the pale. It's not right-wing weirdism. This is exactly how the system is supposed to work. Madison refers to legislative devices being used to resist federal overreaching. Item number 5, coordination among the states. This is discussed, as you can see, in a fairly long excerpt from Federalist number 46. The founders had been through an experience where coordination among the states worked very well for them. Remember the committees of correspondence. Madison believed that when the federal government was exceeding its authority, that committees of correspondence ought to be set up among agencies of state government with other states to coordinate plans. I think he said to resist their plans of oppression, the federal plans of oppression. So that's another device of interposition he mentions. Nullification was not favored by Madison. The term nullification is used sometimes in a broad way and sometimes in a narrow way. When it's used in a very broad way, it means what Madison called interposition, all kinds of state pushback. When it's used in a narrower way, it means the state passing a law announcing that federal law within its jurisdiction is void. So you may have Obamacare passed nationally, and then the states will pass a law saying there's no Obamacare in this state. As Madison recognized, there are certain constitutional and practical problems inherent in nullification. And like Madison, I do not recommend it. If you want to ask Dave and me on Q&A for more information, we don't we don't always fully agree on everything. We can discuss it. But I don't think that nullification, the pure kind of nullification, has had a great history of success. And then there is finally the last constitutional method of interposition, and that is the state application and convention process. Now, I'll say something about that in a second, but what Madison is saying is that this is the last constitutional step. The one after this is armed rebellion. Armed rebellion. And Madison actually talks about, in Federalist 46, it's quite an interesting paper, about how armed rebellion might work if the federal government, if the federal government exceeded its power and there were no other way to rein it back. Just to make very clear, we are not here to recommend that approach to it. But I do have a certain sympathy with the last constitutional method, and that is the method of the state application and convention process, which Madison is here recommending as a possibility. There is a great deal of mythology about this process, but basically here's the bottom line with it. The founders recognized that you sometimes needed constitutional amendments. You might need a constitutional amendment to actually change the Constitution. Or you might need a constitutional amendment to reinforce the Constitution. We've had both kinds. The first 8 amendments, for example, actually changed the Constitution. The 9th, the 10th, and the 11th Amendment reinforced what the Constitution said anyway. They're called declaratory amendments. So an amendment can be passed, let's say, to force Congress to balance the budget. That changes the Constitution. Or an amendment can be passed to say that Congress has no power over health care. That reinforces the Constitution. There are 2 ways. All amendments to be approved have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. There is no getting around that. But in order to get amendments proposed, there are 2 ways of doing it. One way is for Congress, 2/3 of both houses of Congress, to propose an amendment. The other is for a convention of the states to propose an amendment. The founders put both of those into the Constitution because they thought that Congress could recommend changes when Congress saw that something wasn't working well. But when the problem was Congress, the states needed a mechanism by which they could intervene. This was well understood. This mechanism of a convention of the states to propose an amendment was well understood in most sectors of America until about the 1960s. In the 1960s, several constitutional amendments were proposed by conservatives in order to overturn liberal court decisions. A group of liberal publicists, particularly some folks around Senator Bobby Kennedy, started arguing that a convention for proposing amendments was a constitutional convention that could completely rewrite the Constitution. And that argument stuck with many people, and is now used by opponents of it both on the right and on the left. But it is in fact not an accurate description. The Constitution authorizes 3 kinds of conventions, and none of them is a constitutional convention. So what Madison is saying here is that when Congress is the problem, what the states have to do is get together, come up with a proposed amendment or 2, require Congress is required to call a convention of the states, which then propose an amendment for ratification. That method thus far has never been used, but the roadmap, the rules that the founders intended for it are reasonable. If you're curious about that, consult that part of the Independence Institute website, which I recommend. So those are the kinds of methods of interposition. You could pretty well take your pick. Let me just finish up quickly by saying that there have been a number of different amendments proposed for either clarifying the limits of the federal government or finding some way to restrain Congress. Some of them are better than others. I included a sample here. I'm not endorsing any of them, but if you think that a declaratory amendment or some other kind of amendment is in order, balanced budget or whatever, then there are some suggestions here. And you can, and again, I'm not endorsing any of them, and you can find others on there. So from individual action, individual resistance, right down to a convention for proposing amendments, the states and the people are expected to push back against the federal government when it exceeds its authority. It's how the system was set up.
One of the challenges that I face as teaching constitutional law, one class a year at Denver University, and I suspect Rob faced teaching it full-time at the University of Montana, is explaining to the law students that the Constitution, the constitutional process, how the Constitution really works, is not just about Supreme Court cases. I mean, Supreme Court cases are hugely important in that. But in the long term, they are often a lagging indicator of changes or developments that have taken elsewhere in the rest of our society. And the a famous political character, a guy named Tom Dooley, created by Finley Peter Dunn, a humorist in the early 20th century, they said the court follows the election returns. And that's not true in the most narrow, cynical way you could say it, but it is true that when society as a whole moves in one direction or another, either away from a government of limited or enumerated powers or back towards one, that eventually the courts will catch up with it. So I would give you two mottos to live by. One for Bob Marley: emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. Or as John Adams put it, writing decades after the American Revolution, the revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the hearts and minds of the people, a change in their religious sentiments of their duties and obligations. This radical change in principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections of the people was the real American Revolution. So to continue what will not be a revolution of violence or Second Amendment remedies, but a revolution within our political system, continue to educate yourselves and to communicate with the broader public as informed opinion leaders. Letters to the editor are certainly one useful thing to do that. And letters to Congress are a great idea too. And maybe retro, these days you will have more effect on your Congress people when you write a letter on one of these old-fashioned things. It's made from, like, believe it or not, from a tree that got sliced up. If you send your letter on one of these, rather than on some electronic thing like press here and send spam, basically, to 535 members of Congress, that's not as effective. Something that shows you put some time into it, you care about it, you're not just forwarding somebody's form letter. That will have the most impact on the congressional staff. And of course, politely talk with candidates and with elected officials and educate them as you have the opportunity in these brief encounters. Don't pigeonhole some poor guy for 15 minutes. And volunteer to help candidates who respect the Constitution. My dad served for 22 years as a representative from Denver in the Colorado House of Representatives. And I'll tell you, campaign volunteers make a big difference. And if you have the opportunity to volunteer for Sunday afternoon in October, 2 weekends before the election, that's great. And that really can make the difference in a close election. But if you go further, and you be the person who was putting in, say, 10 hours a week every week for all 10 weeks before the election, I will guarantee you your state legislator and state senator is going to listen pretty attentively to what you have to say. Now, that doesn't mean that the people elected you rather than the guy that was actually on the ballot, but it does mean that at the least your suggestions are going to get a pretty careful hearing from the guy you helped elect. Don't despair that life is a one-way ratchet, that the tendency of government is always to more and more power, and maybe you can slow it down, but you can never push it back. You know, after the massive expansion of the understanding of the commerce power that took place in the 1930s and kept going with even broader and broader interpretations in the 1960s and 70s, constitutional law professors would tell students, and they weren't being, entirely inaccurate here, that basically the Supreme Court seems to have given up on enforcing any limits on the commerce power. And so if Congress just starts some law on any subject that this is about the commerce power, the court's going to let them get away with it. But in 1995, that ended, and the Supreme Court, 5-4, declared unconstitutional the Federal Gun-Free School Zones Act, which obviously has no real connection with commerce among the several states. And as the Supreme Court opinion began, we start with first principles. The Constitution establishes a government of enumerated powers. Now, one of the reasons that there was a Supreme Court that did that in 1995, and not a court that did that in 1975 or 1955, is because through the political process, there had been the election of some presidents who actually believed in that and sometimes obeyed it, such as Ronald Reagan, and appointed judges who were at least open to considering those ideas. And that's, in the long term, it's the federal courts come from appointments by presidents, confirmation by the Senate. So who does the appointing and the confirming makes a very big difference in constitutional law in the long run. Also, don't worry if some right seems like or some provision or some constitutional protection seems like it's in bad shape. The First Amendment, after having been a big issue in the election of 1800 and continued to be reprinted in school textbooks and sort of given lip service in a lot of ways, was certainly ignored by the Supreme Court throughout all of the 1800s and the first few decades of the 20th century. And then, partly in response to increased public consciousness of the importance of free speech, the Supreme Court in the 1930s properly got into the business of protecting First Amendment rights. And that, in fact, helped create a virtuous cycle. Whereas when the court acted to protect rights, that made people more aware of the rights, more firm in the belief in the broad scope of those rights, and that in turn affected the broader social and political culture, which made the next iteration of what the court did able to go further. So you can have things that are long gone and you maybe scoffed at as part of a constitution that's still there textually but not enforced, like the First Amendment, can come back and become part of our real constitution. And certainly the Second Amendment was not bad. In the 1800s, it was pretty well understood, both in federal court decisions and in some state court decisions that interpreted their state right to bear arms provision and also might have said, and the Second Amendment means the same thing. But the Second Amendment was a normal individual right, but then the results, that didn't mean that gun control was impermissible. So, for example, the main line of cases said, well, of course people have a right to bear arms, to carry guns for lawful protection in public. But if the legislature wants to regulate the mode of that, for example, to say you can carry a handgun openly, but you can't carry it concealed, that's okay. But starting in the mid-20th century, and the problem that got quite bad in the 1970s and 1980s was a number of lower federal court decisions said, oh, the Second Amendment, that's not an individual right of the people. Well, what that really means is the Second Amendment is a collective right, or it's a state's right. And by a collective right, They meant it in the same sense that a communist government might say, well, we don't have individual property ownership, but we have collective property ownership. So here in Mao's China, all of the people own the property collectively, which is nice maybe when described at that level of abstraction, but of course it meant that the people had no rights at all and that the government controlled everything. And if you'd gone to law schools or asked your political science professor about this in 1978, he would have said, oh, of course, that the Second Amendment's no barrier at all to gun bans by individuals. It's just a collective rights or a state's right. And you say, well, what does that mean? Does that mean the state can have its own army? Can the state of Arizona say that everybody can own a machine gun? Because we in Arizona, the Arizona legislature says everybody in Arizona is part of the Arizona State Militia, and we want them to all have machine guns, regardless of the restrictions that the Federal National Firearms Act puts on that. And the guy would have had no answer to that and would have called you a crazy extremist and a danger to society. But the Second Amendment, however dead it was in practice in the federal courts and in much of the legal academy, remained alive and well in the hearts and minds of the American people, partly thanks to pro-rights civic responsibility organizations such as the National Rifle Association. And as scholars, and legal scholars such as myself and Stephen Hallberg and David Hardy and many, many others, went back and examined the legal history of the Second Amendment, the origins of the amendment, and what had once been well known but had now been forgotten, it became increasingly clear that the Second Amendment really did protect a normal, meaningful individual right, and we were able to explain this in scholarly journal articles, and thanks to the magic of the internet, to a much wider audience than just the people who've got the print copies of, say, the Denver University Law Review or other journals. And this began to shift elite opinion as well. And so you had President George Bush coming into office as some guy who said, I want to protect Second Amendment rights. You didn't have candidates in 1976, neither President Ford or President Carter argued that they said they wanted to protect Second Amendment rights because they were both convinced there was no such thing as one of those. And so we won the Heller case 5-4 because we'd already won in the legal scholarship and in elite opinion, and both of those wins had been founded on popular opinion. And it was that which sustained the Second Amendment in those dark years, included by, thanks to well-involved citizen activists. Most states, you might agree or disagree with some particular gun laws, but in most states, the right to arms remained an actual, robust, living, valid thing. And if the state legislator, and so in response to citizen concerns, the state legislator said, well, I'm going to vote against this gun control proposal because I believe it's against Second Amendment rights. And if when he was doing that in, say, 1992, he didn't mean it's because it's against Second Amendment rights as the local Circuit Court of Appeals has interpreted cases. It's because I'm against Second Amendment rights as I understand the Second Amendment by reading the text of the Constitution and as my constituents understand that amendment and as they seem to have good arguments in favor of that. And keeping that Second Amendment alive in practice to be exercised helped the social base stay there so that the right could continue to have success politically and in the long term, at the end of the process, judicially. As Rob said, the Second Amendment example is one example of how the state arena is crucial to what happens to the federal Constitution. If we lost on the Second Amendment issues, if Washington, D.C., when it enacted, the City Council enacted their handgun ban in '76, several City Council people said, we know this isn't going to do any good because we're just Washington, D.C., but we hope this is going to get the ball rolling on a national ban. And in fact, there was a big effort to push a national bans. That very next fall, Massachusetts had a handgun ban initiative on the ballot, handgun freeze, was on the no new handguns, was on the California ballot in 1982. In both cases, they lost overwhelmingly. By the end of by the time we come to when the Supreme Court is here in District of Columbia versus Heller in 2008, the only jurisdictions in the United States which banned handguns were DC, Chicago, and 5 Chicago suburbs. And the reason for that was because almost everywhere else, pro-Second Amendment activists have been successful in getting state legislatures to pass preemption laws saying, we, the state legislature, want either completely uniform gun laws throughout our state, or at least to have some basic levels of protection. And part of that is no locality can ban guns, which we in the state legislature don't want to ban, and no state legislature ever wanted to ban handguns. So in a practical sense, I'll tell you, the Supreme Court is a lot more willing to lop off national outliers than it is to go against a national majority or even a significant national minority. If we'd had handgun bans in 70 cities and 6 states when Heller came up, the legal argument wouldn't have been one bit different. Whatever happened in 1792 that tells you about the meaning of the Second Amendment happened, and that wasn't going to change. But in practice, I'm not sure we would have won that case if you had a court that said, okay, this will lead to a few cities and having to change their laws and nothing else, versus we've got to upset a whole bunch of states and cities. So every win we have here in Colorado on any constitutional rights and powers issue is part of a long-term foundation for moving the nation closer to fully enforcing our Constitution. And this same kind of story, which I won't tell in as much detail, happened in lots of other ways. It happened in the 1830s when the people elected Andrew Jackson president of the United States because he believed that corrupt monster, the Second Bank of the United States, was unconstitutional. And he was fully aware that the Supreme Court had said it is constitutional, and he said, that's fine, but I got my own oath to uphold the Constitution. I think it's unconstitutional, so when Congress sends me a bill to recharter the bank and keep it from expiring at the end of its 20 years, I'm going to veto it. And that was the biggest political battle of a decade. And it went back and forth, and it was gigantic. And in the end, Jackson won. His veto was sustained. We got rid of the Second Bank of the United States. And thanks to Jackson's win in that, it drastically reduced the ability of a corrupt, closely tied to the federal government banking establishment. There's nothing wrong with banking, except when its purpose is to distribute money to government favorites rather than to provide banking services in a normal profit-making sense. He killed that, and the economy of the United States was much more prosperous for the rest of the century because he won that fight, and the people were freer to succeed on their own merits rather than having economic success be dependent on political connections with a central bank running out of Washington, D.C. Now, you will run into some people who, unlike Rob, who can give you a very eloquent case in favor of enforcing the Constitution based on its original meaning. And some people will not be convinced by that and will say, well, the Constitution has to evolve and change over time, and it has to be kept up to date. And so constitutional meaning should change over time. Well, whether or not, however that normative discussion comes out, let me suggest one thing to consider for ourselves and also to tell them. Maybe that's true, because we're not here in a law school seminar on constitutional theory where we could talk about that for months and months. But if that's true, then that means the Constitution keeps on living in the 21st century. The Constitution, if it is living, wasn't frozen in amber in 1937 after the Supreme Court gave up on resisting Roosevelt's centralization. Most people here weren't even born in 1937, and those of you who were probably weren't following constitutional law too closely at the time. A living, evolving Constitution can't stay frozen in a new deal that's now old history. Decades of experience. The progressives wanted us to learn from experience. Well, of course we should. Decades of experience have shown us what wasn't necessarily so well understood in 1933 or 36. The bureaucratic government experts are not nearly so proficient and invariably correct as the progressives naively believed. Is the world more complex and interdependent? Absolutely. And experience has shown us today, in 2011, that in that complex, interdependent world, people sitting in a room in Washington, D.C. cannot possibly accumulate sufficient knowledge to make the correct decisions for everyone else. Indeed, no one person or no group of persons can. Rather, decision-making knowledge is almost infinitely dispersed, and free choices made by free people are the best way to collectively utilize that knowledge. Precisely because our national experience is ever more interdependent and complex, centralized planning cannot solve our problems. A living constitution for the 21st century acknowledges the practical, proven failures of old-time progressivism, that whatever they were good, they were for the 1930s. They're not working today, and in fact, the actual original system set up of dispersed decision-making in the 1780s and 1790s by the original Constitution is the one that works out and is most up-to-date for our modern experiences. Now, when you're talking and educating the broader public, because you're all opinion leaders in various concentric circles of your friends and acquaintances and people that work, the greatest tool you have is the text of the Constitution itself. Justice Hugo Black used to carry it around in his pocket, just like some Baptist ministers where he'd grown up in Alabama would carry the Bible in their pocket. The words themselves are pretty effective. You don't need to get into all the detail of, well, what did the dictionaries say about the word commerce or necessary and proper and all that. You can, in a practical sense, point people to what the actual text of the Constitution, just reading it in normal language. The power to regulate commerce among the several states. It's pretty obviously not a power to regulate all economic activity within a single state, or to force people to engage in commerce with a private business like a big part of the big insurance oligopoly if they don't want to. The words of the Constitution speak for themselves. The power to lay and collect taxes and provide for the general welfare of the United States is, by its own words, something that must be exercised for the general welfare of the United States, and not to provide corporate welfare to special interest lobbies. The 10th Amendment is plain on its face, and it informs every reader that the federal government has limited, enumerated powers, and not unlimited powers. Show people the plain words of the Constitution, and you'll have shifted the debate. And in doing so, you can carry out in the 21st century exactly what the Independence Institute is founded on, from which we take our name, the eternal principles of the Declaration of Independence. That the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are not granted by government. They are endowed by our Creator, and that the essential purpose of government is to protect those God-given rights. And so upon all of you falls the solemn duty, not just of American presidents and their oath, but of every generation of Americans, to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States of America. Thank you.